Materials control almost every aspect of how the surfaces of your 3D objects appear. They don't control the lighting, but how the lighting interacts with the objects is also controlled by materials. They're very much related to each other, so we're actually going to be bouncing freely back and forth between materials and lighting because the two are basically inseparable. In order to see the material controls inside Photoshop, you first have to select a material layer, which you can do by default just by clicking on the Materials tab, or here in our Scene window, just selecting a material. And if we grab the first one we come to, the material on the base here, you'll see that that reveals all of these new material options. And this is where a lot of the fun happens in 3D, how you choose to combine these different options. But first, let me give a brief explanation of what some of the key options are. Ambient is not the color of the ambient light in the scene. An ambient light is the sort of base level light. If you turn all the other lights off in a scene, ambient light is the light that's left behind. So in a dark room in a movie, for example, you often see a dark blue ambient light that kind of reveals things even when it's supposed to be pitch black at night. That's ambient light. Well, this isn't the color of the ambient light. This is indicating how much the individual object is reacting to the ambient light. The ambient light itself is set in the scene settings here, global ambient color, which by default is very, very dark, which gives us really dark shadows. You might be tempted to think that you would find ambient lights inside the lighting settings, and in most applications that is where you would find it, but in fact the ambient light is in the scene settings. Moving on down, specular allows you to choose a custom color for the highlights that show up from the lights in the scene. The little bright spots that you see right here at the bottom of our model are a reflection of one of the light sources in the scene. And how these specular highlights look adds a lot of realism to the scene. You might not want those to directly reflect the color of the light source, and so you have the option here of overriding that color. The brightness of the specular lights is controlled by the glossiness setting. The color by the specular chip, the brightness by glossy. Now, diffuse is possibly the most important texture you can work with because it controls the color or image that represents the surface pixels of your model. That color by default when you're building models inside Photoshop is white. It doesn't look like white, it looks like this sort of medium gray, but that's because the default light source inside Photoshop is quite dim. But if we come over and look next to our diffuse layer, it's one of the few layers that already has a pre-assigned Photoshop file. It was created by default, but it does exist inside this model. And in fact, you can see it underneath the texture layers for diffuse, underneath my chalice. And if we hover over it briefly, you can see, in fact, that it's white. It comes up, a little thumbnail pops up and tells us that that texture is white. Now, that may not make sense to you because at a glance, the color next to diffuse looks like this medium to dark gray. Well, this color is the default color of the object if it doesn't have a diffuse map. Our object has a diffuse map, so if we want to see this color, we'd have to click on this and choose Remove Texture, which I'm happy to do because it's pretty much empty. When we do, you'll see that the base now takes on the color of the diffuse color chip. And if we wanted to make that slightly golden, we could. And the results are passed right on through to the scene. The next type of material is self-illumination. This controls how much the object appears to glow. By default, objects don't glow, so that color chip is black. If we were to set this to a slightly higher value, you would immediately see the results in the scene. Let's cancel that. Bump strength controls the height of the bump map for the layer. So there's not a color chip here that's controlling bump strength. That's actually a numeric value. The actual bump map itself has to be created or imported, and we'll be doing that a little bit later in this chapter. Glossiness, we discussed earlier. It controls the overall brightness of the specular highlights. Shininess controls the size of the specular highlights. When the shininess is set to a value of 100%, we get these nice, sharp, specular highlights. We'll adjust this a little bit later when the time comes to create a more metallic look. Opacity, pretty much exactly what you would expect if you set this value down to, say, 50%. You get a transparent result. But because it is a 3D model, you can actually see through the foreground surface of your object to any background surfaces that you might intersect. Let's set that back up to 100%. And the last couple of options worth noting are reflectivity, which controls whether or not the objects in a scene reflect each other. And in addition to reflecting each other, objects in a scene can reflect an environment, and that environment gets loaded in as an image using the environment map controls. Now there's nothing next to environment except this little pop-up, and this little pop-up also exists beside many of the other options in this panel as well. This is the pop-up that allows you to either create new textures right within the document, which you can subsequently edit, or load textures that you have taken the trouble to pre-make. And in our case, under our diffuse map, we're going to load a texture. We'll choose Load. We'll go to My Textures, where just a few moments ago, we created this tarnished, seamless metal texture. And we click Open, which wraps the texture we created around our base. Now, you're probably thinking this doesn't look much like gold. That's true, it doesn't. But it will. We'll just need to make some adjustments to the lights, and we'll need to make some adjustments to a bump map, and we'll need to make a little bit of adjustment to the specular reflections on here as well to get this really looking like gold, which we'll do a little bit later in the chapter. For now, though, we'll finish up this lesson by simply selecting the upper portion of the chalice, coming down to our diffuse, and choosing to load a texture. This will blow away the current texture that was created by default. And once again, we're just going to choose Tarnished Metal Seamless. Click Open. We already have a file in this scene with the path. Basically what this is telling us is that we have two objects in our scene that are referring to the same element on disk. So it's, instead of importing a second copy, it's going to be referring back both objects to the original source texture, which means any edits we make to the original texture will apply to both objects. That's okay in this case. It's not always preferable, but it's okay in this case. Select OK. And there we are. Now, basically, in our current lighting, our current default lighting setup, what we have is what looks like a rusty cup. And that's clearly not what we're going for. We want something that looks golden. And the first step towards doing that will be adjusting the lights.